If season one of the EdTech Curio cabinet explored enduring patterns of teaching and learning, season two turns our attention to something a little different. Not just new tools, but what happens when those tools begin to reshape how learning itself is organized. Over the past few years, education has entered a new technological moment. Artificial intelligence is moving rapidly from research labs into everyday tools. Universities are reconsidering how credentials work, and the boundaries between teaching, assessment, and learning support are beginning to blur. At first glance, these developments can feel transformative, as though education is on the edge of some rapid change. But if season one taught us anything, it's this: education rarely transforms overnight. Instead, new technologies interact with long standing learning practices in ways that are often very subtle and sometimes unexpected. Some ideas flourish, and some fail quietly. And occasionally, something deeper shifts. Not just what we use, but how learning is structured and who shapes it. In season two, we'll explore curiosities that sit at the intersection between emerging technology and enduring educational patterns. We'll ask questions like, what actually happens when AI becomes part of the learning process? Why do institutions struggle to evolve credential systems? What does academic integrity mean when answers can be generated instantly? How do feedback, personalization, and learning environments change when systems begin to respond dynamically? And perhaps most importantly, what happens when the instructor is no longer the only source of knowledge? Because across all of these questions, a larger theme begins to emerge. Learning is becoming more distributed, more connected, and in many ways, more complex. As always, we'll explore these curiosities through four lenses: the artifact, the technology or trend we're examining, the pattern, where we've seen something similar before, the paradox, that unexpected insight hiding inside the story, and the signal, a clue about where learning might be headed next. So let's open the cabinet again. For centuries, one of the most effective forms of learning has been tutoring, a knowledgeable guide working closely with a student. They explain ideas, asking questions, adjusting instruction in real time. Now, unfortunately, tutoring has been difficult to scale. It requires time, expertise, and individual attention. But now something new has entered the educational landscape: artificial intelligence systems that can answer questions, explain concepts, and guide learners through problems. In other words, machines that behave a little bit more like tutors, which raises an interesting question. What happens when the tutor is no longer a person? Welcome back to the EdTech Curio Cabinet. Hello again. I'm Christina, a Curio steward. And in this podcast, we explore curiosities in education through four lenses: the artifact, the technology or practice we're examining; the pattern, where we've seen something similar before; the paradox, the unexpected insight hiding inside the story; and the signal, what it might tell us about the future of learning. Today's artifact is one of the most talked about technologies in modern education: AI tutoring systems. Tools capable of explaining concepts, answering questions, and guiding students through problems. But to understand what these systems might mean for learning, it helps to take a step back and look at a much older idea: tutoring itself. Modern AI systems can now perform tasks that once required human tutors. It can explain complex ideas, it can generate examples on the fly, walk through solutions step by step, provide immediate feedback, and adapt all their responses based on what the student's questions are at that time. For learners studying independently, these tools can feel remarkably helpful. A student that's stuck on a calculus problem can ask for clarification. A learner reviewing physics concepts can request some type of an alternative explanation. And unlike a human tutor, these systems are available at any time. In theory, they could democratize access to personalized learning support, but history suggests that the story might be a little bit more complicated than that. The idea of automated tutoring is not new. Researchers began experimenting with intelligent tutoring systems in the 1970s. Early systems attempted to simulate expert instructors by guiding students through structured problem-solving processes. Some of these systems worked surprisingly well. Students using them sometimes performed as well as those receiving traditional tutoring, but they were expensive to build and very difficult to scale. Modern AI systems change that equation. Instead of designing tutoring logic manually, large language models can generate explanations dynamically, which dramatically lowers the barrier to creating tutoring like experiences. What makes this moment particularly interesting is that we've seen something similar before. In season one, we explored a curio called The Lecture That Refuses to Die. For more than a century, new technologies have promised to replace lectures. Film, television, online learning, MOOCs, each innovation was expected to finally make the lecture obsolete. And yet, lectures persisted, not because universities resist change, but because lectures serve a deeper function. They help organize information, they help organize knowledge, they provide intellectual structure, they model how experts think. And something similar may be happening with AI tutors. These tools may feel revolutionary, but they are entering a learning ecosystem that already contains established practices. So instead of replacing instructors, AI may simply become another layer of support around that learning process. Just as slides, simulations, and digital courseware became companions to lectures rather than replacements. Which brings us to the paradox. AI tutors can explain almost anything, but explanation alone doesn't guarantee learning. One of the most consistent findings from cognitive science is that students often feel they understand something before they actually do. Clear explanations can create a sense of familiarity, but the true mastery requires practice, requires retrieval of those concepts, requires experimentation. In other words, learning involves more than just hearing the right answer. It requires engagement with the problem itself, which means AI tutors can be incredibly helpful, but only if they support active thinking rather than replacing it. The most promising future for AI tutoring may not be fully automated instruction. Instead, AI may become a learning companion, helping students clarify ideas, explore examples, receive hints rather than complete solutions, encourage persistence when problems become difficult. When designed thoughtfully, AI systems could support the kinds of productive struggle that learning science tells us are essential. In this sense, AI tutors may become less like answer machines and more like intellectual partners in the learning process. Every generation of education technology promises greater personalization, and AI may finally bring that promise closer to reality. But as always, the real question is not simply what technology can do, it's how technology interacts with the deeper patterns of learning. And those patterns remind us that guidance is valuable, but thinking must also still belong to the learner. Education technology evolves quickly, but the patterns of learning change very slowly. That's why we keep the cabinet open. Thanks for exploring the EdTech Curio cabinet. For most of the modern university's history, credentials have been remarkably stable. Students complete courses, courses accumulate into degrees, degrees signal expertise. But over the past decade, something interesting has started to happen. New forms of credentials have begun to appear: micro-credentials, certificates, digital badges, short programs designed to teach specific skills. And increasingly, learners are assembling portfolios of learning experiences rather than following a single degree pathway, which raises an interesting question. Is the traditional degree structure evolving, or are we simply adding more layers to the same system? Welcome back to the EdTech Curio Cabinet. Hello again, I'm Christina, the Curio Steward. And today's Curio explores something that sits at the intersection of education, economics, and technology: credentials. Because while teaching methods evolve and learning technologies change rapidly, credentials remain one of the most powerful structures in education. Because while teaching methods evolve and learning technologies change rapidly, credentials remain one of the most powerful structures in higher education. They signal expertise, they open doors to employment, and shape how learners organize their educational journeys. But today, the system is beginning to shift. Micro-credentials are short learning programs designed to certify specific skills. They might represent mastery of a programming language, a data analysis technique, a professional competency, or a specialized area of knowledge. But unlike traditional degrees, which often require years of study, micro-credentials can sometimes be earned in weeks or months. Digital technologies make them easy to issue, verify, and share, which has made them increasingly attractive to both learners and employers. But the idea of alternative credentials is not entirely new. Throughout history, educational institutions have experimented with different ways of recognizing learning: apprenticeships, professional certifications, continuing education programs, industry credentials. Each of these systems emerged to meet a specific need, and many of them coexisted alongside traditional degrees. The modern wave of microcredentials may represent another chapter in this long story. This is where something we explored in season 1 becomes particularly relevant. One of the curios we examined was why STEM assessment still looks the same as it does in 1950s. Despite decades of technological innovation, many assessments still resemble the same formats used generations ago. You have problem sets, exams, structured assignments, and at first glance, that persistence can seem very surprising. But the reason is actually quite simple. Assessment plays a special role in education. It's not just about measuring learning, it's about creating trust. Students trust that their work will be evaluated fairly. Employers trust that credentials represent real capability. Institutions trust that standards are maintained, which means assessment systems change slowly, sometimes much more slowly than teaching technologies. And that helps explain why credential systems also evolve cautiously, because credentials ultimately depend on the credibility of the assessments that are behind them, which brings us to the paradox. Microcredentials promise flexibility. They allow learners to build skills incrementally. They respond quickly to changing industry needs. They create opportunities for reskilling without requiring full degree programs. And governments around the world have begun to support this shift. Here in Canada, we have initiatives with microcredential strategies and funding programs that encourage colleges and universities to develop short, workforce aligned credentials. Similarly, in the European Union, they've introduced formal framework for microcredentials, including shared definitions and quality standards across their member states. And our neighbors in the US, policy conversations supported by organizations like the Department of Education increasingly focus on short-term credentials and alternative pathways into employment. All of this points to the same direction: more credentials, more pathways, more flexibility, but it also creates a new challenge. If the number of credentials expands dramatically, how do employers interpret them? Which credentials represent deep expertise versus short-term exposure? Which are assessed rigorously? And which are simply participation-based? In other words, increasing the number of credentials can make the entire system far more complex, more complicated even to apply it in practice, not less. And that's the paradox. The very flexibility that makes microcredentials powerful can also make them harder to interpret and put in practice. Despite these challenges, the rise of microcredentials may signal an important shift. Education may become more modular. Rather than following a single linear pathway, school, degree, career, learners may begin to assemble their education over time, combining short courses, professional experiences, traditional degrees, certifications from industry, any type of ongoing upskilling. This idea is increasingly reflected in policy. The European Union's microcredential framework explicitly supports stackability, the ability to combine smaller credentials into larger recognized qualifications. Here in Canada, federal and provincial initiatives have emphasized lifelong learning ecosystems, where individuals can re-enter education at different stages of their careers. And then further, organizations like the World Economic Forum have highlighted the growing importance of continuous reskilling in response to technological change. Technology makes this possible. Digital platforms can track learning across institutions, credentialing systems can verify achievements, and learning records can accumulate over time. But modularity introduces a new requirement: this concept of coherence. Learners need to understand how different credentials connect. Employers need to understand how to interpret them. And the institutions play a critical role in that process, not just delivering the content, but helping to structure pathways, ensuring quality, providing recognizable signals. And in this sense, the future of education may not be less institutional, but differently institutional. Less about a single fixed journey, but about guiding learners through this evolving pathway over time. Credentials are not just pieces of paper, they are signals of trust. and they represent a shared understanding between educators, employers, and society about what someone knows and what they can do. As education evolves, the systems that communicate that trust may evolve as well, but the underlying goal remains the same: helping learners demonstrate meaningful expertise. Education technology evolves quickly, but the patterns of learning change slowly. That's why we keep the cabinet open. Thanks for exploring the EdTech Curio cabinet. For generations, homework has served a simple purpose. Students practice what they've learned, instructors review the work, and the assignment becomes evidence of understanding. But recently, something new has entered the picture. Students can now ask artificial intelligence systems to generate explanations, write essays, even solve complex technical problems, which raises an uncomfortable question. If a machine can complete the assignment, what exactly does the assignment measure? Welcome back to the EdTech Curio cabinet. Hello again, I'm Christina, the Curio steward. And in this podcast, we explore curiosities in education using 4 lenses: the artifact, the technology or trend we're examining; the pattern, where we've seen something similar before; the paradox, the unexpected insight hidden inside the story; and the signal, a small clue about where learning might be headed next. Today's Curio sits right at the intersection of learning technology and assessment: artificial intelligence that can complete student assignments. Modern generative AI systems are remarkably capable. They can write essays, generate computer code, solve many types of mathematical problems, explain concepts in multiple ways, and even walk step by step through a solution. For students working independently, these tools can feel like incredibly helpful study partners. A student can ask for clarification, they can request another example, or explore a concept from multiple angles in real time. In that sense, AI can function almost like an always available tutor. But homework sits at a unique position in education. It happens outside the classroom. It is typically unsupervised. And it has historically served as both practice and evidence. And that's where the tension begins. Recent research and policy discussions have started to focus specifically on this issue. The International Center for Academic Integrity has highlighted how generative AI tools complicate traditional assumptions about authorship and independent work. And at the same time, guidance from the UNESCO has emphasized that AI tools can support learning, but only if their use is clearly understood and intentionally designed for. So the question is no longer simply, can students use AI for homework, but rather, what role should homework play in a world where answers can be generated instantly? This is not the first time technology has disrupted traditional assignments. Calculators once raised questions about whether students would still learn arithmetic. Search engines changed how students approach research. Online collaboration tools blurred the boundaries between individual and group work. And in each case, educators initially worried that technology might undermine learning. But over time, assignments adapted. Calculators became standard tools, and math education shifted towards conceptual understanding. Research assignments evolved from finding information to evaluating and synthesizing it. And collaboration became an intentional part of many learning environments. Recent discussions around AI and homework reflect a similar pattern. Researchers and educators in groups like EDUCAUSE have noted that generative AI is not simply another tool. It is a tool that produces outputs that look like completed assignments, which makes its impact on homework particularly pronounced. And this connects directly to something we explored in Season 1. In Why STEM Assessment Still Looks Like the 50s, we saw that assessment systems tend to change more slowly than the technologies that surround them, because assessment doesn't just support learning. It signals competence, it certifies achievement. So when new tools emerge, educators don't abandon assignments, they simply rethink them. Now, for many years, homework has quietly served 2 roles. It helps students practice, and it provides evidence of learning. But generative AI has begun to separate those 2 roles. If a student can generate a complex answer to a problem, the assignment itself may no longer reliably demonstrate understanding. And this is where the paradox emerges. The more capable AI becomes at producing correct answers, the less those answers tell us about what the student actually knows. Recent conversations in higher education, including policy guidance from institutions and frameworks discussed by organizations like OECD, increasingly reflect this dynamic tension. Educators are beginning to recognize that traditional homework may no longer serve as a clear signal of individual understanding. But that doesn't mean homework is less valuable. It simply changes its role. Homework may return more explicitly to its original purpose: practice, a space where students experiment, make mistakes, explore ideas, develop their understanding. Even if AI is involved in that process, in this sense, AI doesn't eliminate homework, it reframes it. One signal emerging from this shift is that assessment may become more interactive and more focused on process. If homework becomes less reliable as proof, then evaluation may increasingly happen in environments where thinking can be observed. Educators are already experimenting with approaches such as having students explain their reasoning in real time, having them demonstrate their problem solving ability in a guided session, oral assessments or short defenses of their work, iterative assignments where students show how their thinking evolves, and then the structured use of AI, where students must critique or refine generated outputs. These approaches align with broader guidance emerging from higher education organizations and policy bodies around the world. UNESCO emphasizes the importance of AI transparency and critical judgment, encouraging students not to just use AI tools, but to understand and evaluate them. And this points to a broader shift. Assessment may move away from asking, can the student produce the answer? And towards asking, can the student understand, explain, and apply the idea? In a world where machines can generate answers easily, the thinking process becomes the most valuable evidence of learning. Every new technology forces education to revisit an old question. What does it actually mean to know something? If knowledge were simply the ability to produce answers, machines would now outperform most students. But education has never really been about answers only. It has always been about developing the ability to reason, analyze, and solve problems. And those capabilities remain profoundly human. Education technology evolves quickly, but the patterns of learning change slowly. That's why we keep the cabinet open. Thanks for exploring the EdTech Curio cabinet. When people talk about education technology, they often talk about access: more content, more courses, more information. But over the past several decades, education research has pointed to something else, something quieter, and something often more powerful: feedback. Because learning doesn't just happen when we encounter ideas, it happens when we test our understanding of them and discover when we're wrong. Welcome back to the EdTech Curio cabinet. Hello again, I'm Christina, the Curio steward, and today's Curio is something deceptively simple: feedback. The artifact is the rise of automated feedback systems. The pattern is something much older: how humans have always learned through guided response. The paradox is that while content has become abundant, meaningful feedback remains scarce. And the signal may be one of the most important shifts in education technology: that the future of learning may be built not around content delivery, but around feedback loops. Modern learning platforms can now provide immediate responses to student work. A student solving a calculus problem might receive instant feedback on their answer. A programming assignment might run automated tests. And interactive simulations might show the consequences of a design decision immediately. These systems dramatically shorten the feedback cycle, and students no longer have to wait days or even weeks to discover whether their reasoning was correct. Instead, they can adjust their thinking in real time. And this matters more than it might first appear. Research that's summarized in Make It Stick highlights that learning is strengthened when students actively retrieve knowledge and receive feedback on those attempts. Similarly, work by John Hattie has shown that feedback is among the most powerful influences on student achievement. But not all feedback is equal. It must be timely, specific, and connected to the learner's thinking. And this is where technology begins to play a meaningful role, not by replacing instruction, but by accelerating the feedback loop. To understand why feedback matters so much, we need to look at a much older pattern: tutoring. One of the most effective forms of learning is the knowledgeable guide working closely with the student, asking questions, providing hints, correcting misunderstandings, and adjusting explanations based on the learner's responses. Education researcher Benjamin Bloom famously identified the two sigma problem, showing that students who receive one-on-one tutoring often perform dramatically better than those in traditional classrooms. And at the heart of tutoring is something simple: immediate responsive feedback. But this pattern goes even deeper, all the way back to early childhood learning. Developmental psychologist Lev Vygotsky described learning as occurring within the zone of proximal development, the space where a learner can succeed with guidance. In early childhood, this shows up in a number of ways: a parent correcting a child's pronunciation, a teacher guiding a student through a puzzle, iterative feedback during play. Students learn through these rapid cycles of attempting something, getting feedback, and then adjusting. And importantly, these cycles are immediate, interactive, and responsive. The same pattern appears in higher education, even if we don't always design it explicitly. It also connects to something we explored earlier in the season in When a Tutor is a Machine. AI tutoring systems attempt to replicate this pattern, but the pattern itself is much older. Learning has always been feedback-driven. Now here's the paradox. Technology has made educational content widely available. Students can access lectures and tutorials, examples, even entire courses at any time, from anywhere. But feedback remains relatively scarce. A student might watch hours of educational videos, but unless they actively attempt problems and receive responses to their thinking, the learning process may remain incomplete. Cognitive science reinforces this idea. Research on retrieval practice shows that attempting to recall and apply knowledge, especially with feedback, strengthens the long-term learning far more than passive review. In other words, information alone does not produce understanding. Interaction does. And interaction requires feedback. So while technology has solved the problem of access, it has not fully solved the problem of response. And even with the promise of impressive displays of AI at the top of everyone's minds, there is still the question of trust in how or what is providing that feedback. One of the strongest signals emerging from modern learning environments is the growing importance of continuous feedback. Instead of learning being structured around occasional high-stakes events like exams, assignments, midterms, we see a shift towards environments where feedback is constant. Practice, response, adjustment, iteration. Feedback at every stage of the learning journey. These feedback loops mirror how expertise is developed in many domains: musicians that are refining a performance, athletes that are adjusting their technique, engineers that are testing and improving designs. And importantly, they also mirror how children learn through repeated attempts, guided correction, and gradual refinement. Technology now allows us to bring that same pattern into higher education at scale, not by simplifying learning, but by making it more responsive, more interactive, more aligned with how understanding actually develops. Education often focuses on delivering knowledge, but learning depends just as much on correcting misunderstandings. Feedback reveals where thinking went wrong. And more importantly, it shows learners how to move forward. It transforms mistakes into insight. And in this sense, feedback is not simply a response, it is a core mechanism of learning itself. And perhaps one of the most important questions for education going forward is not how do we deliver more content, but how do we create more opportunities for meaningful feedback? Education technology evolves quickly, but the patterns of learning change slowly. And sometimes the most powerful innovations are the ones that bring us closer to how people have always learned. That's why we keep the cabinet open. Thanks for exploring the EdTech Curio cabinet. When we think about modern education, we often picture classrooms, students sitting together, listening to lectures, completing assignments. But for most of human history, learning happened very differently. People learned by doing, working alongside experienced practitioners, gradually taking on more responsibility as their understanding grew. And this model had a name: apprenticeship. And interestingly, elements of this very old learning model are quietly returning into modern education. Welcome back to the EdTech Curio cabinet. Christina, the Curio steward. And today's Curio explores a fascinating historical loop. One of the oldest learning models in human history may be quietly reemerging in modern education, sometimes supported by some of the newest technologies. To explore that idea, we'll look at the artifact, the pattern, the paradox, and the signal. Across universities and professional programs, there is growing emphasis on what educators often call experiential learning or work integrated learning. You'll hear those referred to as internships, industry projects, co op programs, applied research. Students increasingly encounter opportunities to apply what they are learning to real problems. Sometimes they work directly with companies. Sometimes they collaborate in project teams that mirror professional environments. And sometimes they engage in simulated experiences, all using digital platforms to design systems, analyze data, or solve complex scenarios. And technology often helps enable those experiences. Simulation environments offer students the opportunity to test ideas in a controlled setting. Collaborative platforms allow distributed teams to work together. And increasingly, students can engage with authentic problems from anywhere, not just within the walls of a classroom. But the idea behind these ideas and these models is not new. In fact, it's very old. Long before formal universities, people learned through participation, by observing, by attempting, by receiving guidance, by refining their understanding through practice. What we now call work integrated learning is in many ways a modern expression of apprenticeship reintroduced through contemporary tools, but grounded in a much older model of learning through doing. For centuries, skilled professions were learned through apprenticeship. A learner would work alongside an experienced practitioner, watching and practicing, and gradually taking on more responsibility. That learning did not occur primarily through lectures or exams. It happened through observation, feedback, and repeated attempts at real work. Over time, modern universities shifted away from this model. Classroom instruction allowed knowledge to scale. One instructor could teach hundreds of students at once, but something interesting is happening today. The elements of apprenticeship are returning, and they are returning not because classroom education failed, but because the modern world increasingly values the ability to apply knowledge into a complex situation. This idea connects strongly with arguments made by journalist and educator Fareed Zakaria in his book In Defense of a Liberal Education. Zakaria argues that education should not focus narrowly on training people for specific jobs. Instead, it should cultivate broad intellectual abilities, critical thinking, communication, creativity, and the ability to adapt to new challenges. In other words, education should help students learn how to think, not simply what to do. And interestingly, apprenticeship models can support exactly that. When students confront real problems, they must integrate knowledge from many areas. They need to show technical understanding, communication, judgment, adaptability. These are precisely the qualities Zakaria argues define a strong liberal education. Here's the paradox. In a world increasingly shaped by advanced technology, the most forward-looking learning models may resemble the oldest ones. Apprenticeship-style learning encourages students to apply ideas, collaborate with others, and navigate real-world uncertainty. And in doing so, it reinforces something much deeper than technical skill. It develops judgment. It develops context, adaptability. This connects directly to the argument made by In Defense of a Liberal Education. Zakaria emphasizes that education is not only about preparing students for specific jobs. It is about cultivating intellectual agility, the ability to think critically, communicate effectively, and adapt to changing circumstances. And this is where the paradox becomes especially interesting. Experiential learning is often framed as practical or career-oriented, but in reality, it may be one of the most powerful ways to develop the broader capabilities associated with liberal education. Because when students engage with real problems, they quickly discover that those problems do not fit neatly within disciplinary boundaries. They must interpret ambiguous situations. They have to integrate knowledge from multiple domains, communicate with different audiences, and adjust that approach as new information emerges. So, in other words, they must think, not just execute. The paradox is that the most applied forms of learning may also be the most intellectually expansive. The signal emerging from this Curio is that education may increasingly move towards integrating theory and practice more intentionally. Rather than separating learning into distinct phases, first theory, then application, students may move fluidly between them. Classroom instruction introduces concepts, projects allow those concepts to be tested, industry engagement provides context, and then research deepens that understanding. And finally, reflection connects experience back to theory. Technology plays an important enabling role here. It allows institutions to connect students to external partners, simulate really complex environments, support collaboration through these different locations, and then track and assess applied learning. But the deeper goal is not technological, it is developmental. The kind of education Curio describes prepares students not just for their first role, but for a lifetime of learning, a lifetime of navigating unfamiliar problems, adapting to new contexts, continuing to grow intellectually. In this sense, the return of apprenticeship does not compete with liberal education. It complements it, even strengthens it by grounding abstract ideas in real-world contexts where those ideas matter, and by helping students experience something essential. That knowledge is not static. It is something we use, something we refine and build upon continuously. Education has always wrestled with an important question. Should it focus on practical skills or on broad intellectual development? The answer, increasingly, may be both. Students benefit from understanding ideas deeply, but they also benefit from applying those ideas in a meaningful situation. Apprenticeship-style learning environments help bridge that gap. They turn abstract knowledge into a lived experience. Education technology evolves quickly, but the patterns of learning change slowly. That's why we keep the cabinet open. Thanks for exploring the EdTech Curio cabinet. For decades, one of the most appealing promises of education technology has been personalization. The idea is simple. Every student learns differently. Some move quickly through concepts. Others need more time to explore ideas and practice new skills. So why should every student follow exactly the same path through a course? Modern learning platforms can now adapt content dynamically for students. They can recommend different exercises, adjust difficulty levels, and guide learners through an individualized pathway. And at first glance, this sounds like the ideal learning environment. Each student receives exactly what they need, exactly when they need it. But education has always been more than an individual journey. Students don't just learn from content. They learn from each other, from shared discussions, from encountering the same ideas at the same moment and interpreting them together. So the real question may not be whether personalization improves learning. It most certainly can. The question is something more subtle. What happens to shared intellectual experience when every learner follows a different path? Welcome back to the EdTech Curio cabinet. Hello again, I'm Christina, the Curio steward. And in the EdTech Curio cabinet, we explore curiosities in education technology using 4 lenses. First, the artifact, the technology or trend we're examining. Second, the pattern, where we've seen something similar before. Third, the paradox, the unexpected insight hiding inside the story. And finally, the signal, a small clue about where learning might be headed next. Today's Curio explores one of the most widely celebrated ideas in modern education technology, personalized learning. The ability for technology to adapt content, pace, and instruction to the needs of each individual learner. On the surface, personalization seems like an obvious improvement. But like many innovations, particularly in education, the deeper story becomes more interesting when we ask how these technologies interact with the social nature of learning. Adaptive learning platforms are designed to respond to individual student performance in real time. They analyze how a student answers questions, they identify patterns and errors, and adjust instructional pathways dynamically. A student struggling with a concept might receive additional explanations, targeted practice questions, and scaffolded problems. Now, a student that's progressing quickly might skip ahead, they'll encounter more complex material, and possibly explore advanced applications. These systems build on decades of research in intelligent tutoring systems, including early work by Beverly Park Wolf, whose research helped define how instructional systems could model student understanding and adapt accordingly. In many ways, these systems aim to approximate one of the most effective forms of learning we know: individualized instruction. This connects the work of Benjamin Bloom, who showed that one-on-one tutoring could significantly improve student outcomes, a phenomenon we touched on in an earlier talk this season, the 2 sigma problem. Adaptive systems attempt to scale that idea. And today, they are increasingly common, particularly in mathematics and STEM disciplines, where structured problem solving makes adaptation easier to design and implement. So technologically, this is impressive. But learning has always involved more than individual progression through content. Educational research has long emphasized that learning is not purely an individual process. It is also deeply social. In our episode on feedback, we briefly touched on psychologist Len Vygotsky's argument that learning often occurs through interaction with others, particularly within what he called the zone of proximal development, a space where a learner can succeed with guidance. Students build understanding not only through the individual effort, but through discussion, explanation, collaboration, shared problem solving, and more recent research reinforces this idea. Studies on peer instruction show that students often learn more effectively when they explain concepts to one another, because explaining requires them to organize and articulate their thinking. This connects directly with something we explored in season 1. In the lecture that refuses to die, we observed that lectures persist partly because they create a shared intellectual experience. Everyone encounters the same idea at the same time. And in active learning, we saw that engagement, especially collaborative engagement, deepens understanding. These patterns suggest something very important. Learning is both individual, where we do the processing, practice, and reflection, and collective, where we have discussion, comparison, shared meaning. And effective learning environments typically balance both. Now here's the paradox. Personalization improves efficiency. Students progress at their own pace. Misconceptions are identified and addressed quickly. Learning pathways adapt to the individual needs of the student. Now, from a system perspective, this looks ideal. But learning isn't only about efficiency. It's about shared discovery. When students encounter the same ideas, they can compare interpretations with one another, they can challenge one another's thinking, and build understanding together. But in a highly personalized environment, students may have different examples, different problems, and different sequences of ideas, which makes a shared discussion very difficult. The classroom becomes less of an intellectual space and more of a set of parallel individual experiences. So the paradox is this: the more precisely we tailor learning to individuals, the harder it may become to create a shared meaning. And shared meaning is often where deeper understanding develops. The signal emerging from adaptive learning research is not that personalization is flawed. It is that it is incomplete on its own. The most promising direction is not full personalization, but intentional combination. Hybrid learning environments that integrate individual practice, supported by adaptive systems, collaborative discussion and peer interactions, and instructor-led synthesis and framing. In this model, adaptive systems help students build foundational understanding, and then the classroom interactions help students test those ideas, articulate reasoning, and encounter alternative perspectives. Instructors then help connect individual learning to a coherent shared experience. This aligns with a broader pattern we've seen across the Curio cabinet. Technology is most powerful when it supports, rather than replaces, core learning processes. And those processes include individual cognition and social interaction. In this sense, adaptive learning systems are not the endpoint. They are one component of a larger ecosystem, one that must still account for the fundamentally social nature of learning. Adaptive learning systems represent an important advancement. They allow instruction to respond to individual needs in ways that were previously difficult to achieve at scale. But they also remind us of something essential. Learning is not just about moving efficiently through content. It is about developing understanding. And understanding often emerges through interaction between ideas, between people, between different perspectives. This challenge is not just choosing between personalization and shared learning. It is designing environments where both can coexist. Education technology evolves quickly, but the patterns of learning change slowly. And sometimes the most important insights come not from what technology makes possible, but from what it reveals about how people learn. That's why we keep the cabinet open. Thanks for exploring the EdTech Curio cabinet. For most of modern education, there's been a simple assumption: the teacher is the source of knowledge. Students come to class, and the teacher explains. But today, the assumption is beginning to shift. Students can access explanations instantly. They can ask questions to systems that respond immediately. They can explore ideas without waiting for instruction. So if the teacher is no longer the primary source, what happens to teaching? Welcome back to the EdTech Curio Cabinet. Hello again, I'm Christina, and here in the EdTech Curio Cabinet, each episode explores a curiosity from the evolving world of teaching and learning. We examine these curios through 4 lenses: the artifact, the technology or trend we're looking at; the pattern, what history reveals about similar shifts; the paradox, that unexpected tension hiding inside the story; and the signal, what this might tell us about the future of education. Today's curio explores a subtle but important shift: not whether teachers are replaced, but what happens when they are no longer the primary source of knowledge. Artificial intelligence systems are now capable of acting as always available explainers. Students can ask questions at any time. They receive explanations in multiple forms. They can come back and request examples tailored to their level of understanding and revisit concepts without social pressure. Education researcher Luckin has described this as a shift towards systems that can support learners continuously, outside the constraints of scheduled instruction. This is something different than earlier technologies. Textbooks provided information, videos delivered explanations, but AI systems respond. They adapt, they engage, which changes something fundamental. Students no longer depend exclusively on the instructor to access understanding, and that shifts where the authority lives in the learning process. There's a broader pattern that appears across many domains. When access to information expands, authority shifts. Now consider what happened in journalism. When information became widely accessible online, journalists were no longer the sole gatekeepers of news. Or in medicine, patients now have access to vast amounts of medical information, so doctors are no longer the only source of knowledge. But their role obviously didn't disappear. It evolved towards diagnosis, judgment, and guidance. That same pattern is beginning to emerge in education. As access to explanations expands, the instructor is no longer the sole authority on content. And when authority shifts, roles must be redefined. So here's the paradox. As students gain more direct access to knowledge, instructors may have less control over the learning process. Students can explore topics independently, they'll encounter alternative explanations, and they'll move ahead or fall behind outside the structure of the course. From one perspective, this reduces the instructor's control, but at the same time, it increases their responsibility. Because now the challenge is not delivering content, it is helping students make sense of what they encounter and distinguish strong explanations from the weak ones. It's also helping them connect ideas across contexts and stay intellectually grounded. Educational researcher Lee Schulman emphasized that teaching involves understanding how learners interpret ideas, not just presenting them. That becomes even more important in environments where students encounter information from many sources. The paradox is this: the less instructors control what students see, the more important their role becomes in helping students understand it. Now, the signal emerging from this shift is not about replacing instructors. It's about redefining teaching as sense-making. In this model, the instructor is not the primary source of information. They are a guide that helps students interpret ideas, navigate the complexity of these ideas, help them resolve confusion that emerges, and build a coherent understanding. The classroom becomes less about delivering content and more about discussion and synthesis, reflection, intellectual framing. Now, technology expands access, but the instructors shape the meaning, and meaning is where learning happens. This shift can feel unsettling because it changes a long-standing assumption that teaching is about explaining. But perhaps teaching has always been something else, not just providing answers, but helping students understand what those answers mean. In a world where explanations are abundant, that role becomes even more important. As new tools enter education, the question is not whether teachers disappear. It's how does their role evolve? And sometimes the most important changes are not about what is added, but about what moves. That's why we keep the cabinet open. Thanks for exploring the EdTech Curio cabinet. Across this season, we've explored a series of changes in education. Artificial intelligence generating explanations, feedback systems responding instantly, credentials becoming more modular, assignments evolving in response to new tools, learning environments becoming more connected. Now, at first glance, these might seem like separate trends, but taken together, they point to something deeper. A shift in where learning happens, and more importantly, who shapes it. Welcome back to the EdTech Curio cabinet. Hello again, I'm Christina, and in this season, we've explored how technology is reshaping learning. As always, we've looked at these changes through 4 lenses: the artifact, the tools and systems emerging, the pattern, what history tells us about similar shifts, the paradox, the tensions those shifts create, and the signal, what they might mean for the future. And across each of these curios, a common thread has emerged. Learning is becoming more distributed, less confined to classrooms, less dependent on a single source of authority, and more shaped by networks of tools, systems, and interactions. Which brings us to the final question for this season. If learning is no longer contained in one space, who owns it? Today, learning rarely happens within a single system. A student might watch a lecture through one platform and then complete an adaptive practice in another, perhaps receive feedback in an automated system, and then ask questions of an AI assistant. They might then collaborate with peers in a shared digital space and then apply knowledge through real world or simulated environments. And increasingly, these systems are not just delivering content, they are participating in the learning process. They generate explanations, they evaluate responses, they suggest next steps. In other words, they influence how understanding develops. This is a shift from tools that support learning to systems that actively shape it. And as we saw earlier this season, this raises important questions about authorship, agency, and interpretation. When systems of knowledge expand, one thing consistently becomes more important: trust. We've seen this pattern before. When printing expanded access to information, institutions emerged to validate knowledge. When the internet made information abundant, new systems developed to evaluate credibility. And in education, something similar is happening now. As learning becomes distributed across tools and environments, the question is no longer just what can students access, but what can we trust? This connects directly to something we explored earlier this season in the episode on homework and generative AI. When answers can be produced easily, the meaning of those answers becomes less clear. And this is where academic integrity enters the conversation, not simply as a question of rule following, but as a question of authentic learning. The International Center for Academic Integrity emphasizes that integrity is fundamentally about ensuring that academic work reflects genuine understanding. But when learning is distributed across systems, some human and some artificial, that boundary becomes harder to define. So the pattern is clear. As systems expand, the need for trust does not diminish, it intensifies. Now here's the paradox. Students today have more support than ever before. They can access explanations instantly. They receive feedback continuously, and they use tools that help them complete complex tasks. But at the same time, it can become harder to determine what they actually understand. If an AI system helps generate an answer, where does a student's thinking begin and end? If a platform guides each step, how much of the reasoning is independent? If multiple systems contribute to that process, who is the learner? The paradox is this: the more support we provide, the less certain we become about what learning has actually occurred. And this is not just a technical problem, it's a philosophical one. It challenges how we define knowledge, authorship, and understanding. The signal emerging from this season is not that learning belongs to any single entity, not the student, not the instructor, not the institution, and certainly not the technology. Instead, learning becomes something that is orchestrated across systems, environments, experiences, and interactions. In this model, the role of education shifts. It shifts from delivering knowledge to shaping coherent learning journeys. Institutions may increasingly focus on validating learning across different contexts, or ensuring integrity in distributed environments, or simply helping learners connect experiences into meaningful understanding. And instructors, as we explored earlier, help students make sense of what they encounter, not by controlling every input, but by guiding the interpretation. Across this season, one idea has taken shape. Learning is no longer confined. It moves across tools, across environments, across moments. But as it moves, it becomes harder to see clearly, harder to interpret, and harder to trust. And that may be the real challenge of modern education. Not access, not capability, but coherence. Learning is becoming more open, more flexible, and more distributed. But understanding still requires structure, it still requires meaning, and it still requires trust. And as education continues to evolve, these elements may become more important than ever. That's why we keep the cabinet open. Thanks for exploring the EdTech Curio cabinet. Before we close the cabinet on season 2, it's worth stepping back. This season began with tools, artificial intelligence, digital platforms, new forms of credentials, and new ways of learning. But along the way, something else became clear. These were not just changes in technology, they were changes in structure. Learning became more distributed, more modular, more connected, and in many ways, more complex. We saw that access expanded, feedback is accelerated, pathways diversified, and authority shifted. But as these changes unfolded, a deeper question emerged. If learning no longer lives in one place, under one system, guided by one authority, then what holds it together? Because learning does not happen in isolation. It happens within systems, institutional systems, cultural systems, national systems. And those systems shape what learning looks like in ways that are often invisible. Which brings us to the next set of curios. Because in season 3, we step back again, beyond tools, beyond individual learning experiences, and into the systems that shape education itself. We'll explore why some countries emphasize rigor, while others emphasize exploration, how examination systems shape behavior, and how institutions balance specialization and breadth. And finally, how these patterns repeat across different regions and time periods. Because if season 2 asked, how is learning changing? Season 3 asks, why does learning take the form it does? But for now, we'll close the cabinet on season 2. Thanks for exploring the EdTech Curio cabinet. And as always, keep asking curious questions.